Okay, hello year 12. We're going to look now at chapter 2 of book 2 of Mouse. We're looking here at Auschwitz time flies. I believe we talked about in class the flies and the significance that they are time flies and that they're coming from the past, and that's revealed further on this page here where we can see that the flies, which are a representation of guilt, are emerging up out of this pile of dead bodies. So time flies is not only alluding to the fact that we've actually moved forward in time, because if we look over here, we're looking at a period of time where art is reflecting on everything that happened in book 1. So the death of his father, for example. So time flies has multiple meanings there. And notice here we've got these horrific images as well of the mice burning in the furnaces. And it's quite a confrontational and graphic image that we're seeing. And it's definitely called here Auschwitz, as to compare to Mauschwitz before, possibly to remind us that this is real. This is a horror that happened. All right, so this narrative is what we call super-present or meta-narrative, and we can tell this because of the strings and the fact that he is depicted, as in art, or Spiegelman is depicted as a human who is wearing a mouse mask, okay? So this part of the narrative is all about the process of creating mouse, So all about the creation of mouse 1, and it's him reflecting on his successes. And it's really important to note that this triple-layered narrative wouldn't be possible in any other form. We would not have this in traditional text. It would be too complicated. So having this meta-narrative is part of the features of the graphic novel. We can also say that the mouse mask is symbolic of his struggle to identify with his father's story. And we can see this further because he compares himself to what his father went through. So he says, in May 1987, Francois and I are expecting a baby. Between May 16, 1944 and May 24, 1944, over 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed in Auschwitz. So maybe he's saying that Auschwitz is, I guess, like a presence or a ghost from the past, and his father's story is constantly on his mind. And we'll talk about father-son relationships in class, and we can talk about the fact that he feels inadequate compared to Vladek. Then down the bottom, we look here and it says at least 15 foreign editions are coming out, and I've gotten 4 serious offers to turn my book into a TV special or movie. So he's referring here to book 1. So remember, we talked about the fact it's published initially as weekly installments of a comic book series, then book 1, then book 2, and then more recently what we've got in front of us, which is the Complete Mouse, book 1 and 2. So he's reflecting on his success, and he's thinking about the process he's undertaken working on the book and how he feels about creating it. And here he says, lately I've been feeling depressed, which is really interesting when we connect it with, of course, these guilt flies and the fact that his art easel is coming up out of a pile of dead bodies. So maybe we could say that he feels anguish or he feels guilty that he's succeeding, or that his previous success seems to be because others suffered before him. Like he's capitalizing off a Holocaust story of his parents and other Jews that he didn't live through. So he wonders what right he has to tell the story. So I guess the question we could say for this bottom panel is, does he have the right to tell us something, to tell readers something he doesn't experience? I've also had people suggest that in the background here, this is the watchtower from Auschwitz, okay? And that this is the light from like the watchtower shining down. So it's like Auschwitz is a continued presence. Auschwitz is like a ghost from the past that is still like watching over him in the same way his father seems to be a presence that he can't escape. So if we flick over, then we've got this panel here, and we're looking at the reporters, and notice they're different nationalities here, which is really interesting. So we've got an American dog, we've got maybe like a cat here, and then another American, and they're all interviewing him, but they're still wearing the masks. So maybe that suggests that they are merely caricatures of that nationality. I'm not entirely sure that we can chat about that in class. But notice how he feels while he's being spoken to by the reporters. He feels flustered, he feels overwhelmed. We notice here that the reporters are literally climbing over the piles of dead bodies to get to him. So he feels like he's really disrespecting the past at this stage. Feels really unsure about what has actually happened, all right? And then they ask him questions here like, okay, let's talk about Israel. So we know that Israel is the Jewish state. So I think he gets confused because he's being asked to comment on things that he never claims to know about. Because here they say, if your book was about Israeli Jews, what kind of animal would you draw? And he says, I have no idea, porcupines. So the whole idea that once he opens this can of worms, he's expected to know everything, so to speak. And we can notice here too, especially in these last few panels, he's still of a normal size, but by this point here, he started to shrink. All right, so he's feeling very overwhelmed, very guilty. All right, and at this point he says, I want my mummy. So again, the guilt of the past. He continues to get smaller, all right, in these pages, and he doesn't start to grow again until he meets Pavel. Look, here he's climbing onto his chair. He talks about his father being a ghost hanging over him. So again, he can't escape the traumatic legacy of his parents' Holocaust story, even though him and Francois have moved on with their lives. But then we come to this part with Pavel. So he says, Pavel is my shrink. He sees patients at night. He's a Czech Jewish survivor of Auschwitz. I see him once a week. His place is overrun with stray cats and dogs. And we've talked about this scene here where it says, can I mention this, or does it completely last up my metaphor? So this is Spiegelman kind of poking fun at himself and saying that the metaphor is not rigid, of course, because he stuffs it up if he says that the psychiatrist, who's a cat, has stray cats and dogs. So he feels weighted down when he begins to visit his psychiatrist, Pavel. He feels belittled by like the gravity and the guilt pressing on him of his father's experiences. And he also feels deprived of the boyhood that he feels he deserved, all right, with his father. He feels like somehow he feels like things aren't right, okay? But as he talks to Pavel, he goes from shrinking, as seen here because he's trying to climb onto the chair, to beginning to grow again. And then here he's taking the mickey out of himself again, where he says framed photo of a pet cat, really. All right, turning the page. His size has diminished a little bit again, and it might be because he's talking about the arguments he had with his father. We will write on this whole idea of a fractured father-son relationship, about why they can't get along, and he feels like at times all he represents are the negatives of Vladek. When he says here, mainly I remember arguing with him and being told that I couldn't do anything as well as he could. And then we've got this really famous quote here, and he says, no matter what I accomplish, it doesn't seem like much compared to surviving Auschwitz. I think that's really important. Artie feels, Spiegelman feels inadequate. He feels like no matter what he achieves, his father survived the Holocaust, so nothing he does will ever live up to that, all right? So that's really important. It's the basis of a lot of essays. It's the basis of a lot of our discussion, this quote. No matter what I accomplish, it doesn't feel like much compared to surviving Auschwitz. So he is riddled by the guilt of having had an easier life than his father, all right? Pavel tries to talk him around it, sort of thing. He tries to say maybe your father was guilty. He took the guilt out on you where it was safe, etc. So it's like this residual guilt that's passed down, so to speak. All right. Pavel asks him if he admires his father for surviving, and he gives a really unclear answer. He talks about his father being resourceful and everything, but he doesn't necessarily say. And then Pavel says, "You think it's admirable to survive? Does that mean it's not admirable to not survive?" And he gets quite confused here, and Pavel tries to point out to him that it's not really clear, okay? It's not really a clear-cut issue. It's not something that we can just decipher in one day sort of thing. We've also got the framed photo again of a pet dog in the background, which is quite interesting, whether he's deliberately trying to louse up his own metaphor. This is a really good quote here too, in the top where the cursor is, where it just says, "What Auschwitz felt like? How can I explain? Boo." I think that's really good because it tries to explain to Artie that it's really hard to understand. It's a great quote that you can use in some of your essays too, when you're talking about guilt and Artie's attempt to try and understand, and the fact that he always feels like he's not good enough or not doing a good enough job. Okay? And then down the very bottom of the page, notice that he says, "But these sessions with Pavel somehow make me feel better," and we see the growth here. He comes back to normal size. However, as soon as he's back at his easel and listening to his father's tapes here, because here we are back to his father's tapes, this is what he's listening to. Notice the capitalization. This is when he starts to feel inadequate again. It's like his father's ghost is a presence over him again. Notice the circular motif, the fact he's almost in a spotlight, and it's them arguing again, and he's just listening to it. I'm going to flip forward a few pages. I want to look at this page just here, where we've got this diagram. So the diagrams and stories that are placed in the book remind us that what is happening is real. So this diagram of the camps that Vladek has drawn, it symbolizes the true horror, and it's Spiegelman's way of trying to convey to the reader the actual reality of the situation and how this happened and how it is all the truth, so to speak, or all a reality that once existed. We've just got more of this historical narrative here, where he's gone back and he's listening to his father's tapes. Then we've got a really interesting passage, a couple of passages just up the top here with the orchestra. So the orchestra is actually being blotted out by the people because they argued about whether there was an orchestra. So he says, "I just read about the camp orchestra that played as you marched out the gate." And Vladek says, "An orchestra?" And he says, "No, I remember marching, not any orchestras." And Artie says, "I don't know, but it's still very well documented." And then Vladek, "No, at the gate I heard only guards shouting." Okay, so he has to somehow try and visually represent this tension. How can you represent this? So he does it by having the orchestra kind of fade into the background, that they're still there, but that maybe the prisoners don't notice. So as they're marching, it just sort of happens and they just sort of blend into the background, so to speak. On the next passage I want to focus on, sorry I zoomed out too much there, is when the past turns into the present. So this is a great passage to note as well. It's page 218 in your books, okay, if you've got the same version as me. Remember, in the digital copy numbers are different. So we've got this little section just here, okay, where Vladek is actually trying to explain something to Artie, and he's doing it in like modern day New York, and it's the whole face left, face right, and he's talking about the whole process of selection in front of the notorious or infamous Dr. Mengele. And so we can see that this is happening, that Vladek is doing these things. He's